The colony ship Perseverance drifted through the cold darkness of space like a metal coffin. And inside its rusted halls walked the last human alive on board, a 17-year-old girl named Elara Vance, who had forgotten what it felt like to sleep without fear. 3 years had passed since the engines died. 3 years since the screaming stopped. 3 years since she buried her mother and father in the cargo bay with nothing but a torn blanket to cover their bodies. She had been 14 when the disaster struck. A skinny girl with bright eyes who loved reading old Earth novels and dreaming about the new world, waiting for them at the end of their journey. Now those bright eyes had turned cold and hard like stones at the bottom of a frozen river. 12,000 colonists had boarded the Perseverance with hope in their hearts. And 12,000 colonists had died when the ship lost power and the life support systems failed one section at a time. Elara survived because her father had been an engineer who knew the ship better than anyone. And in his final hours, he sealed her inside the emergency bunker with enough supplies to last 6 months. But 6 months turned into 6 years of waiting for rescue that never came. And the supplies ran out after the first year. She learned to hunt the rats that infested the lower decks, learned to recycle water from the cooling systems, learned to patch her clothes with strips of fabric cut from the uniforms of the dead. The Perseverance became her kingdom and her prison, a maze of dark corridors where she knew every corner and every shadow. And then they came, the things from between the stars. She never knew what to call them. Those creatures made of darkness and hunger that phased through the hull like ghosts and hunted her through the endless nights. The first time she saw one, she screamed and ran until her lungs burned and her legs gave out. The second time, she hid in a ventilation shaft for 3 days without food or water, listening to them scratch at the walls. The third time, she fought back with a welding torch and a metal pipe. And she discovered something that changed everything. They could be killed. It took her months to learn their patterns, to understand how they moved and where they were vulnerable. And it took her even longer to master the strange energy that flowed into her body. Each time she destroyed one of them by the end of the second year, she was no longer prey. She was the predator. The creatures stopped coming after she killed the last of them. And she was alone again with nothing but silence and memories. She was sitting in the cockpit staring at the stars when the Council patrol ships appeared on the sensors, their sleek hulls gleaming like silver knives against the black void. For one moment, her heart leaped with hope, and she remembered what it felt like to be a scared little girl who just wanted someone to save her. Then, the ship scanned her vessel, and the communication channel crackled to life with voices speaking in a language she did not understand. She activated the universal translator her father had installed years ago, and the alien words became clear in her ears. Unidentified vessel. You have entered sovereign space of the Galactic Council without authorization. Prepare to be boarded and submit to inspection. Elara pressed the transmit button with trembling fingers and spoke the first words she had spoken aloud in months. This is the colony ship Perseverance from Earth. We sent distress signals for years, but nobody answered. Am the only survivor, and I need help. There was a long pause before the response came, and when it did, the voice was colder than the vacuum outside. Human vessel. Your species has been classified as Category 0 by Council decree. You have no rights in this space, and your presence is considered contamination. Do not resist or you will be terminated. The boarding party arrived within the hour. Tall, pale beings with silver eyes and flowing robes who looked at her like she was an insect crawling across their dinner table. They called themselves the Voltheri, and they were the oldest and most powerful species in the galaxy, rulers of 1,000 worlds and masters of psychic abilities that lesser races could barely comprehend. Their leader was a female with eyes like frozen mercury who walked through the ship with obvious disgust on her elegant face. How Did this creature survive alone for so long? She asked one of her soldiers. Not bothering to address Alara directly, the soldier scanned Alara with a device that hummed and beeped before answering in a tone of mild surprise. Her physical readings are unusual elevated neural activity. Traces of unknown energy signatures. She may have been exposed to something during the voyage. The female Valkyrie waved her hand dismissively and turned away. It does not matter. She is human, and that is crime enough. Bind her and take her to Nexus Prime for judgment. Alara did not resist when they clamped the energy shackles around her wrists. Did not struggle when they dragged her aboard their ship and threw her into a holding cell barely large enough to stand in. She simply watched and waited and remembered. She remembered the sound of her mother coughing blood in the final hours. She remembered her father's hand shaking as he sealed her inside the bunker and told her to be brave. She remembered the 12,000 names carved into the walls of the memorial she had built in the cargo bay. 12,000 souls who had trusted the universe to be kind and learned too late that kindness was a lie. The Volturi guards laughed at her as they walked past her cell, making jokes about the primitive creature from the backward planet who thought she could travel among the stars. They did not notice the way her eyes tracked their movements, memorizing patrol schedules and weapon placements. They did not see the cold fire burning behind her quiet expression, the rage that had kept her alive through 3 years of hell. They saw a small human girl, weak and helpless and alone, and they assumed she was nothing. That was their first mistake. The journey to Nexus Prime took 7 days, and Alara spent every moment preparing. She studied the guards through the transparent wall of her cell, learning their habits and weaknesses. She tested the limits of her shackles, finding the tiny flaws in their construction. She reached deep inside herself and touched the strange power that coiled in her chest like a sleeping serpent. The gift she had taken from the creature she had killed. The Valkyrie thought they were bringing a prisoner to face justice. They had no idea they were bringing a weapon to the heart of their empire. When the ship finally docked at Nexus Prime, the largest space station in the known galaxy, Alara allowed the guards to drag her through the gleaming corridors. Without resistance, she kept her head down and her eyes humble, playing the role of the frightened captive, but inside her mind, she was counting steps and measuring distances, building a map of the station that would serve her when the time came, and the time would come soon. She could feel it in her bones. A certainty as cold and hard as the void between the stars. The Galactic Council had ignored her people's cries for help and let them die in the darkness. Now she was here, standing in the heart of their power, and she was going to make them answer for what they had done. Not today, not tomorrow, but soon, very soon. The Grand Tribunal Chamber of Nexus Prime was the largest room Alara had ever seen. A vast cathedral of crystal and light that stretched upward until the ceiling disappeared into a soft golden glow. Thousands of alien beings filled the observation galleries, creatures of every shape and size and color imaginable, all gathered to witness the judgment of the human prisoner. Some had scales that shimmered like rainbows, others had fur as white as snow, and still others had no solid form at all, but existed as clouds of glowing mist that pulsed with curious light. Alara stood alone in the center of the chamber, her wrists still bound by energy shackles, her simple clothing torn and dirty from days of captivity. She looked so small against the grandeur of the room, a tiny figure surrounded by giants who stared down at her with expressions ranging from disgust to pity to cold indifference. At the far end of the chamber rose a throne of pure crystal that seemed to capture and bend the light around it. And upon that throne sat the most terrifying being Alara had ever encountered. High Adjudicator Varth Kellen was ancient, even by Valkyrie standards. His pale skin stretched thin over bones that looked as delicate as glass, his silver eyes burning with a power that made the air itself feel heavy. He had presided over 10,000 trials and delivered 10,000 death sentences. And in all that time, no one had ever challenged his authority or questioned his judgment. His psychic presence filled the chamber like an invisible weight, pressing down on every mind present and reminding them who held the true power in this room. Alara felt the pressure more strongly than anyone, a crushing force that tried to push her to her knees and break her will before the trial even began. But she had survived things far worse than an old alien with mind tricks, and she planted her feet firmly on the floor and refused to bend a minor. Official stepped forward and began reading the charges in a loud, clear voice that echoed off the crystal walls. The prisoner before us is designated human female 773, captured in council space aboard the derelict vessel Perseverance. She stands accused of unauthorized entry into sovereign territory, biological contamination of a restricted zone, and the fundamental crime of existing as a member of a Category 0 species. Murmurs rippled through the observation galleries as the official continued. Under council law, Category 0 species are deemed too violent and unpredictable to be permitted expansion beyond their home systems. The human species was classified as Category 0 following their first contact with Council scouts 200 years ago, and all humans found outside Earth space are subject to immediate termination. Alara listened to the words with a face as blank as stone, but inside her chest, the cold fire burned hotter with every passing moment. She had learned about the Category 0 classification during her time in the holding cell, piecing together the truth from fragments of conversation between the guards. Humanity had reached out to the stars with open hands and hopeful hearts, only to be slapped down and told they were not worthy of joining the galactic community. The Council had looked at humans and seen only their capacity for violence, their history of wars and conflicts, and decided that such a species could never be trusted. So they had drawn a line around Earth and declared that any human who crossed it would be killed without mercy or hesitation. The Perseverance had been one of many colony ships that tried to find a new home beyond that line, and the Perseverance had paid the ultimate price for that dream. Varath Kaln raised one thin hand, and the chamber fell silent, every voice dying away as his psychic power demanded obedience. When he spoke, his voice did not come from his mouth, but appeared directly inside the minds of everyone present, a cold whisper that carried absolute authority. This creature before us is proof of why the human species must be contained. Look at her. This savage child who survived alone through violence and brutality. She is exactly what we feared humanity would become if allowed to spread among the stars. Alara felt his words slithering through her thoughts like snakes, trying to make her feel small and worthless and ashamed. The humans are a plague, Varath Kaln continued, a disease that must be quarantined before it infects the civilized galaxy. This one specimen is dangerous enough, but imagine what would happen if we allowed millions of them to roam free among peaceful worlds. Several species in the galleries nodded their agreement, their faces twisted with fear and hatred, directed at the small girl standing alone in the center of the room. But not everyone agreed, and Alara noticed that some of the observers watched her with different expressions, sympathy perhaps, or curiosity, or something that might have been respect. The sentence for her crimes is clear and absolute, Varath Kaln declared, his psychic voice rising to fill every corner of the chamber. She will be executed by neural dissolution, her consciousness torn apart and scattered to the void as a warning to any other humans who dream of escaping their prison world. A ripple of satisfaction passed through the Volturi observers, while other species looked away or whispered nervously to their neighbors. Alara stood perfectly still through all of it, showing no fear and no anger, her face a mask of calm that gave nothing away. But when Varath Kaln finished speaking and looked down at her with those cold silver eyes, expecting to see a broken creature begging for mercy. She did something no defendant had ever done in the history of the Grand Tribunal. She spoke. "You ignored us," Alara said, her voice cutting through the silence like a blade through silk. "Our ship sent distress signals for months after the engines failed. We begged for help. We pleaded for rescue. We screamed into the void until our transmitters burned out." The chamber erupted in shocked gasps and angry mutters. But Alara raised her voice and continued. "I know you received those signals because I found the communication logs in our systems. The Council heard us dying and chose to do nothing. 12,000 innocent people. Families and children and dreamers who only wanted a better life. And you let them suffocate in the dark because you thought we were not worth saving." Voreth Kaln's psychic presence slammed down on her like a hammer, trying to crush her into silence. But Alara had spent 3 years fighting creatures made of pure nightmare. She had been broken and rebuilt in the crucible of survival, and no amount of mental pressure could make her kneel. "You call us violent?" she continued, her voice growing stronger with every word. "You call us savage and dangerous and unworthy of the stars. But we never would have let 12,000 people die when we had the power to save them." She looked up at the ancient adjudicator with eyes that burned like cold stars. "Humanity may be violent, but at least we are not cowards. At least we do not murder children through neglect and call it law." The chamber exploded into chaos as 100 different species shouted and screamed and argued with each other. Some demanded her immediate execution for daring to insult the Council, while others called for investigation into her claims. Voreth Kaln rose from his throne, his thin body trembling with rage, his psychic power lashing out like invisible lightning that sent weaker minds crashing to the floor. "Silence!" His voice thundered through every consciousness in the room. The chaos died instantly as everyone froze in place. Paralyzed by the sheer force of his will, Voreth Kaln turned his burning gaze upon Alara, and for the first time in centuries, there was something other than cold indifference in his ancient eyes. There was hatred, pure and absolute and terrifying in its intensity. "You will die screaming, human," he whispered directly into her mind. "And your entire species will follow you into oblivion," Alara smiled. And it was not a pleasant expression. "You can certainly try." The execution platform rose from the floor at the center of the Grand Tribunal chamber. A circular disc of black metal covered with strange symbols that glowed with sickly green light neural. Dissolution was considered the most humane form of capital punishment in the galaxy, though Alara thought the aliens had a very strange definition of humane. The process would tear her consciousness apart piece by piece, destroying her memories and emotions and identity over the course of several agonizing minutes while her body remained alive and screaming. It was designed to be a spectacle, a demonstration of council power that would discourage anyone from challenging their authority. Voreth Kaln stood at the edge of the platform with his arms raised high, his ancient face twisted into an expression of righteous satisfaction as he prepared to deliver the killing blow himself. "Let all who witness this execution remember the fate of those who defy the Council," he announced, his psychic voice filling every mind in the chamber. "Let the humans on their prison world learn what happens when they reach beyond their station." Guards dragged Alara toward the platform, their grip bruising her arms as they forced her up the steps and pushed her to her knees at the center of the black. The symbols beneath her began to pulse faster, their green light growing brighter as the execution device powered up. Thousands of eyes watched from the galleries above, some eager for blood and others sick with horror, but none willing to speak out against what was about to happen. Alara looked up at the faces staring down at her and felt something cold and heavy settle into her chest. A weight that had nothing to do with fear. It was disappointment. She had spent 3 years alone in the darkness, fighting to survive against impossible odds, holding on to the desperate hope that somewhere out in the galaxy there were beings who would help her if she could just reach them. Now she knew the truth. There was no help coming, no rescue waiting beyond the stars, no kindness hiding in the hearts of these ancient civilizations. There was only power and cruelty, and the strong crushing the weak, because the council had let her people die. And now they were going to kill her for having the audacity to survive. But Alara Vance was not the same frightened girl who had hidden in a bunker while her parents died. She was something new, something forged in the fires of loss and tempered by years of fighting creatures that should have been unstoppable. And she was done being afraid deep inside her chest. In the place where the cold fire lived, she felt the power stir and stretch like a predator waking from a long sleep. Creatures from between the stars have been ancient beyond imagining. Beings of pure darkness and hunger that existed in the spaces between reality. And when Alara killed them, she had absorbed something of their essence. At first, she thought it was just energy. A strange warmth that helped her heal faster and fight harder than any normal human should be able to, but over time, she realized it was something more, something that changed her at the deepest level of her being. She could feel the boundaries between dimensions now. The thin walls that separated normal space from the void where the creatures had come from. She could sense the flow of time and matter around her. The patterns and pathways that connected everything in the universe, and if she pushed hard enough, she could step between those patterns and move through reality like a ghost passing through walls. She had never tested the full extent of her power because she had never needed to. But she had always known this moment would come. The moment when she stopped running and started fighting back. Vrath Kaun raised his hands above his head and closed his silver eyes, drawing upon the vast psychic energy that flowed through his ancient body. By the authority of the Galactic Council, he intoned, "I condemn this creature to dissolution. May her consciousness be scattered to the void, and her species learn the cost of defiance." Green lightning crackled around the edges of the platform as the execution device reached full power. Ready to tear Alara's mind apart at the adjudicator's command, the guards stepped back, their faces eager with anticipation. The observers in the galleries leaned forward, hungry for the spectacle of death, and Alara smiled it with a small smile, barely visible on her young face. But those closest to the platform saw it and felt a sudden chill run down their spines. There was something wrong with that smile. Something that did not belong on the face of a condemned prisoner about to die. "You know what I learned in 3 years alone on that ship," Alara said, her voice quiet but somehow carrying to every corner of the vast chamber. Vrath Kaun paused, surprised that she was still capable of speech with the weight of his psychic power pressing down on her mind. "I learned that the universe does not care about fairness or justice or mercy," she continued. "I learned that the weak die and the strong survive, and that is the only law that matters." She raised her head and looked directly into the kitten adjudicator's silver eyes. "I also learned that there are things in the darkness, between the stars, that even you do not understand, things that hunt and kill and consume everything in their path." Vrath Kaun's eyes narrowed with confusion and the first faint stirrings of unease. "What are you talking about, human?" Alara's smile widened, and her eyes began to glow with a light that was not human. A cold blue radiance that pulsed in time with her heartbeat. "Your patrol ships found my vessel drifting in space, and assumed I was just a lucky survivor. But you never asked yourself how a 14-year-old girl managed to live alone for 3 years on a dead ship." The glow in her eyes grew brighter, spreading across her skin in patterns that resembled the symbols on the execution platform. "You never wondered what happened to the things that killed my people. The creatures from the void that should have devoured me like they devoured everyone else." The energy shackles around her wrists began to spark and hiss as the power inside her pushed against their containment fields. "I killed them," Alara said simply, "one by one over months and years, until none of them were left, and every time I killed one, I took something from it. A piece of its power, a fragment of its essence. She rose to her feet despite the crushing weight of Warth-Kelm's psychic pressure, her body surrounded by an aura of impossible light that made the execution devices green glow look weak and pale. You sentenced my people to death and called it law. You let 12,000 innocents die because you thought humans were beneath your notice. The shackles around her wrists shattered, their fragments dissolving into nothing before they hit the ground. Now, I am going to teach you what happens when you underestimate humanity. Warth-Kelm's silver eyes went wide with something he had not felt in over 1,000 years. Fear. He opened his mouth to call for guards, to unleash his full psychic power, to do anything that might stop what was about to happen, but he was already too Latalara moved, and reality itself seemed to bend around her as she crossed the impossible distance between them in less than a heartbeat. One moment she was standing on the execution platform, small and fragile and human. The next moment she was directly in front of the High Adjudicator, her hand plunging through his chest like it was made of smoke, her fingers closing around something cold and ancient that pulsed with stolen power. "This is for my mother," she whispered. "This is for my father. This is for 12,000 souls who deserve better than you." And she pulled. Warth-Kelm did not die quietly. The most powerful psychic in the known galaxy screamed as Alara's hand closed around his ancient heart. And that scream was not just sound but a wave of pure mental agony that ripped through every mind in the Grand Tribunal chamber. Thousands of beings clutched their heads and collapsed as the dying adjudicators' power lashed out in all directions, shattering the weaker minds of a dozen lesser Velthari and sending cracks, spiderwebbing through the crystal walls. But Alara stood untouched at the center of the storm, her body wrapped in that strange blue light that seemed to exist in a different reality than everything around her. She watched with cold eyes as the ancient creature crumbled before her, his pale skin turning to ash and his silver eyes dimming to dull gray as the life drained out of him. "Impossible." Warth-Kelm gasped with his final breath. "You are nothing. You are human. You cannot." His words dissolved into silence as his body collapsed into a pile of gray dust that scattered across the floor of the chamber. The High Adjudicator of the Galactic Council, terror of 1,000 worlds and master of 10,000 executions, was gone for 3 heartbeats. Absolute silence filled the chamber as every surviving mind tried to process what had just happened. Then the chaos began. Guards rushed toward the execution platform with weapons drawn, their training overcoming their terror as they opened fire on the small human girl who had just killed the most powerful being in the galaxy. Energy beams sliced through the air in brilliant lines of deadly light, enough firepower to vaporize a small ship, all focused on the spot where Alara stood, but she was no longer there. Beams passed through empty space as Alara flickered out of existence, phasing into the void between dimensions, the way the creatures from her ship had done so many times before she reappeared behind the first line of guards, her hands moving in swift, precise strikes that dropped them to the floor before they even knew she was there. She was not trying to kill them. She had no desire to add more death to her conscience, but she would not let them stop her either. More guards poured into the chamber from every entrance, their weapons blazing while council members screamed and fled in all directions. The observation galleries became rivers of panicked bodies as 100 different species tried to escape the nightmare unfolding below them. Some trampled their neighbors in their desperation to reach the exits, while others simply froze in place, unable to comprehend what their eyes were showing. Alara moved through it all like a ghost, flickering in and out of reality, her body passing through walls and weapons and grasping hands as if they were made of nothing but air. She did not rage or rampage or unleash destruction like a monster from the old stories. She simply walked toward the communication hub at the center of the station, leaving a trail of unconscious guards in her wake. The Valkyrie commanders screamed orders into their communicators, calling for reinforcements from the fleet stationed around Nexus Prime. But their voices shook with fear, and their commands came out jumbled and confused. None of them had ever faced a threat like this. A single being who could not be touched or stopped or even understood. They had built their empire on the foundation of their psychic superiority, their ability to crush any resistance with the power of their minds. And now that foundation was crumbling. Beneath their feet, Alara reached the communication hub and phased through the locked doors as easily as walking to a curtain of water. The technicians inside scrambled away from her in terror, abandoning their stations and pressing themselves against the walls as far from the glowing human girl as possible. She ignored them and moved to the central console, her fingers dancing across controls she had never seen before, but somehow understood perfectly. The power flowing through her body connected her to the station systems, translating alien languages and unlocking security protocols that should have been impenetrable. Within moments, she had accessed the primary broadcast array, the same system that transmitted official council decrees to every corner of the galaxy. A view of her own face appeared on screens throughout Nexus Prime, and she knew that same image was being carried to millions of worlds across the civilized galaxy. "People of the council," she said, her voice calm and clear despite the chaos still raging around her. "My name is Alara Vance, and I am the last survivor of the human colony ship Perseverance." She reached into her pocket and pulled out a small data chip, the same chip she had carried for 3 years through all her struggles and battles. "This chip contains the communication logs from my ship, proof that the Galactic Council received our distress signals and deliberately ignored them, proof that 12,000 innocent people were left to die because the Council decided that human lives did not matter." She inserted the chip into the console and began the upload, watching as the files transferred to every receiver in range. The Valkyrie taught us that humanity is violent and dangerous and unworthy of the stars, and maybe they are right about part of that. We are violent when we need to be, and we are very dangerous when we are pushed. Her eyes seemed to glow brighter as she spoke, the cold blue light pulsing with barely contained power. "But we are also brave and stubborn and impossible to break. We survive things that should destroy us, and we come back stronger every time." The upload completed, and Alara stepped back from the console, watching as screens throughout the station began displaying the evidence of the Council's crime. She could already hear the gasps and cries of shock from the technicians behind her, their voices rising in disbelief as they read the translated logs. "Your leaders murdered my people through neglect and called it policy," Alara continued. "They wanted to keep humanity caged on our single world forever, afraid of what we might become if we were allowed to grow." She turned to look directly into the camera that broadcast her image. "Across the stars, they should have been afraid, but not because we are monsters. They should have been afraid because we do not forget and we do not forgive. And we never ever stop fighting for those we love." Explosions echoed through the station as Council warships began firing on the communication hub, trying to cut off her broadcast before she could say any more. Alara felt the floor shake beneath her feet and knew she did not have much time left. "I did not come here for revenge," she said quickly. "I came here for justice, and now the truth is out there for everyone to see." She smiled. And this time, it was not the cold predator's smile she had shown Varthkelm, but something warmer and almost hopeful to the humans still trapped on Earth, waiting for permission to join the galaxy. "Do not wait any longer. Build your ships and take to the stars. This is your message from the void." The walls around her began to buckle as another explosion rocked the station. "We are not alone anymore, and we are never going back in our cage." She cut the transmission and closed her eyes, reaching deep into the well of power that burned in her chest. Gathering everything she had for one final effort, the warships outside were targeting this section of the station, preparing to blow it apart and kill her along with it. But Ilara had not survived 3 years of hell just to die. Now she opened her eyes, and the world around her dissolved into light as she stepped between the dimensions and vanished from Nexus Prime. The communication hub exploded a heartbeat later, consumed by fire and fury that left nothing but twisted metal and drifting ash. But the damage was already done. The truth was out, and nothing in the galaxy would ever be the same again. The galaxy burned with the fire of revelation within hours of Ilara's broadcast. The evidence of the Council's crimes had spread to every corner of civilized space, copied and recopied by beings who could not believe what they were reading. The communication logs from the Perseverance told a story of casual cruelty that shocked even those who had long suspected the Veltari of corruption. 12,000 distress signals sent over 6 months, each one more desperate than the last, and each one marked as received and deliberately ignored by Council monitoring stations. The worst decision to let the humans die had not been made by some low-level bureaucrat or accidental oversight. It had come directly from the High Council itself, signed by Varth Kelm and 3 other senior adjudicators, had discussed the colony ship in their private chambers and concluded that allowing any humans to survive outside Earth space would set a dangerous precedent. Better to let them perish and blame it on the dangers of space travel than to acknowledge that humanity was capable of building ships that could cross between the stars. The revelation shattered the carefully constructed image of Velthari benevolence that had held the Council together for millennia. Species that had long resented their psychic overlords found their voices at last, demanding answers and accountability from leaders who had always claimed to rule through wisdom and compassion on a dozen worlds. Protests erupted as ordinary citizens took to the streets, their anger directed at both the Velthari and the local governments that had enabled their crimes. Some of these protests turned violent as Council security forces tried to suppress the uprising, but the violence only added fuel to the flames. The old order was crumbling, and nothing the Velthari did could put it back together again. Ilara watched it all from the cockpit of the Perseverance, which still drifted in the same patch of space where the Council patrol had found her weeks ago. She had phased back to her ship after escaping Nexus Prime, her body exhausted and her power nearly depleted from the effort of her escape. But she was alive, and she was free. And for the first time in 3 years, she allowed herself to feel something other than cold determination. She felt hope. The galaxy was changing because of what she had done. And though the path ahead was uncertain, she knew it would be better than the world she had left behind a week after the broadcast. The first ships arrived, not Council vessels coming to capture her, but refugees fleeing the chaos she had unleashed. They were members of species that had been oppressed by the Velthari for centuries. Beings who saw in Ilara's defiance a chance to finally break free from the chains that had bound them. They came with gifts of food and medicine and technology, far beyond anything humanity had ever possessed. And they came with something even more valuable: information. The refugees told Ilara about the secret routes through Council space, the hidden bases where resistance movements had been organizing for decades, and the weaknesses in Velthari, defenses that had never been exploited because no one had been brave enough to try. They also told her about Earth, about the humans still trapped on their homeworld who had received her message and responded with a wave of activity that the Council surveillance satellites could not ignore. Factories that had been dormant for decades were coming back to life, churning out ships and weapons and equipment for a journey to the stars. Young men and women were volunteering by the thousands, ready to fight for the future that had been denied to them for so long. And At the center of it all was a simple message that had become a rallying cry for the entire human species. We are never going back, and our Kage Lara spent months traveling from system to system, meeting with resistance leaders and sharing the power she had gained from the creatures of the void. She could not give others the same abilities she possessed, but she could teach them what she knew about the beings that lurked in the spaces between dimensions. Armed with that knowledge, the resistance began hunting the creatures themselves, building weapons and defenses that had never existed before. The void touched, as they came to be called, became the elite warriors of a growing rebellion that spread across the galaxy like wildfire. 1 year after Alara killed Vareth Keln, the first human warships crossed into Council space. They were crude compared to the elegant vessels of the established civilizations, built from salvaged parts and stolen technology, and the sheer determination of a species that refused to be contained. But they were crewed by men and women who had inherited Alara's fury, who had grown up hearing stories of the 12,000 martyrs and the girl who had fought back. They came not as conquerors, but as liberators, offering aid and alliance to any world that wanted to break free from Velthari rule. Some species rejected them, still too afraid of the old masters to embrace the new hope, but many more welcomed the humans with open arms, seeing in their fierce determination a reflection of their own long-suppressed desire for freedom. The Council tried to fight back, of course, gathering their fleets and their psychic warriors for a final desperate defense of their crumbling empire, but they had waited too long and grown too comfortable in their power. While humanity had spent centuries being sharpened by adversity and struggle, the war that followed was brutal and costly, claiming lives on both sides and scarring worlds that had known peace for millennia. But the outcome was never truly in doubt. Humanity fought with a ferocity that the Velthari had never imagined possible, throwing themselves into battle with a disregard for personal safety that seemed almost suicidal. They fought for their lost brothers and sisters on the Perseverance, for the generations that had been denied the stars, for the simple right to exist as equals in a galaxy that had tried to cage them. And slowly, inevitably, they won. Alara did not lead the final assault on the Council capital. That honor went to younger warriors who had grown up in her shadow, but she was there when the Velthari High Command finally surrendered. She stood on the steps of the Grand Tribunal chamber where she had once been sentenced to death, watching as the new flag of the Human Alliance was raised above the crystal spires of Nexus Prime. Tears streamed down her face as she thought of her mother and father, of the 12,000 souls who had died dreaming of this moment without ever knowing it would come. "We did it," she whispered to the empty air, hoping somehow they could hear her. "We made it to the stars. The galaxy would never be the same. Humanity had arrived, and they were here to stay." In the years that followed, Alara became a legend, the girl who had killed a god and sparked a revolution, but she never sought power or glory for herself. She spent her remaining years traveling between worlds, helping to build the new civilization that rose from the ashes of the old. She saw humans and aliens working side by side, creating something better than either could have achieved alone. She saw children growing up in a galaxy where no species was considered lesser than another, where the old categories and classifications had been swept away like dust before a storm. And on quiet nights, when the weight of her responsibilities became too heavy to bear, she would return to the Perseverance and walk its empty halls, remembering those she had lost and thanking them for the strength they had given her. The ship had been preserved as a monument, a tomb and a temple to the 12,000 who had died, so that humanity might one day reach the stars. Alara would sit in the cockpit and look out at the vast darkness of space, no longer seeing emptiness and fear, but possibility and hope. "We made it," she would say again, smiling at the stars that stretched out before her like an infinite sea of light. And somewhere beyond the veil of reality, she liked to imagine that her parents smiled back,